Xylo Forbartz can kill divine beings, survive death itself, and walk through poison that melts human flesh. But every single one of these abilities exists for one reason: to keep him alive long enough to suffer. This is every ability Xylo has in Sentenced to be a Hero, and the first one is exactly what got him sentenced in the first place. The first ability is Divine-Killer Swordsmanship, and this isn't just some fancy sword technique you learn in training. This is a high-speed combat style that was specifically designed to find and destroy the core of divine beings, which means Xylo was trained to kill goddesses before he ever got sentenced. When he moves in combat, it's calculated and brutally efficient because every strike is aimed at weak points that most fighters wouldn't even know exist. And this is shown in episode 1 during the forest fight, where he dismantles Blight monsters instantly by targeting the exact spot where their magical core is located. The monsters don't stand a chance because while they're charging at him with claws and teeth, he's already identified where their life force is concentrated, and his blade cuts through it like it's nothing. But here's what makes this ability so dark. It's Deicide Swordsmanship, meant to kill divine beings, which means the government took a man who was trained to murder goddesses and then sentenced him to use that exact skill set to fight demons for eternity. However, raw sword skill alone wouldn't be enough to survive the front lines, because Blight monsters don't just attack from melee range, which brings us to his second ability, Explosive Heat Daggers. Xylo carries specialized throwing daggers that he can ignite and detonate at will, and when he throws them, the heat builds up inside the blade until it hits the target, and then it detonates with enough force to blow the outer shells off monsters that are armored with demon bone and corrupted flesh. He uses these to create distance when enemies swarm him and to crack open the defenses of larger foes so his sword can reach their core. But the real genius of this ability is how it synergizes with his swordsmanship, because while enemies are reacting to the explosion and their armor is cracked open, Xylo's already closing the distance with his blade, ready to finish them. Meanwhile, the heat element means these daggers can cut through Blight corruption that would normally regenerate, and that's crucial because Blight monsters heal and adapt and keep coming unless you burn away their ability to regenerate. And yet, even with perfect swordsmanship and explosive daggers, Xylo should have died 100 times by now, because the front lines are a meat grinder where soldiers die every single day. But he doesn't stay dead, and that's because of his third ability, the Resurrection Mark. This is a passive ability that activates automatically when Xylo suffers a fatal wound, and it doesn't heal him, it completely resets his physical body after death as if he was never injured in the first place. This is shown in episode 2 during that nightmare sequence, where Xylo wakes up gasping because he just experienced dying and then being forcibly dragged back into his body. Every time he dies, the mark triggers and pulls his soul back into a reconstructed version of himself. Therefore, death isn't an escape for him anymore, because the mark won't let him leave. And this means he can take risks in combat that would be suicide for anyone else. But here's the cost that makes this ability horrifying. Every single resurrection burns away pieces of his memory and personality to fuel the spell, which means the more he dies, the less human he becomes, and eventually, if he dies enough times, he'll turn into what they call a hollow, with no thoughts and no past and no sense of self remaining. The resurrection mark keeps him alive, but it's slowly erasing him. But survival isn't enough when you're fighting demon lords and corrupted divine beings, because those enemies require firepower that normal weapons can't provide, which is why Xylo's fourth ability changes everything: Teoritta Sync First Form. Teoritta is a 13th goddess of swords, and Xylo formed a pact with her at the end of episode 1, and when he holds her divine tool, she transforms into a high-output magical blade that can cut through invulnerable demon armor like it's paper. This isn't just some fancy sword power boost, it's the difference between scratching a demon lord's shell and actually killing it, because divine weapons bypass the natural resistances that corrupted beings have, and they can damage things that exist on a spiritual level. When Xylo activates Teoritta Sync, his blade glows with divine energy, and suddenly he's swinging a weapon that was designed by a goddess specifically to kill the unkillable. This is his primary boss killer move. However, the fact that it's called First Form means there are higher levels of this power that we haven't seen yet. But the dark side of this ability is that the pact binds Xylo to Teoritta permanently. He can't end the contract unless both of them agree or she dies, which means he's now leashed to a divine being for the rest of his existence, and considering he was sentenced for killing a goddess, the irony of being permanently bound to another one is brutal. Meanwhile, all of this offensive power wouldn't matter if Xylo couldn't even breathe on the battlefield, because the front lines aren't just dangerous from enemies, they're toxic, and that's where his fifth ability comes in, Blight resistance. Episode 3 explicitly shows the difference between regular soldiers who are choking and collapsing in the purple demon Blight mist, and Xylo who's moving through it easily like the air is completely normal. The Blight mist isn't just poison, it's concentrated demonic corruption that rots flesh and turns people into mindless creatures called fairies if they're exposed too long. But Xylo can walk through it and fight in it and even breathe it without suffering any of those effects. This means the government can send him into the deepest Blight zones where no normal soldier could survive, and he'll still be functional. But here's the implication that makes this ability disturbing. If Xylo has Blight resistance, then that means his body has been permanently altered by the sentencing process, and the fact that he can breathe demonic corruption suggests that he's no longer entirely human anymore. And yet, even Blight resistance and divine weapons wouldn't save him in certain situations, because sometimes the battlefield itself is the trap, which is why his sixth ability is Gravity Adjustment Boots, magic-infused gear that allows Xylo to change his own weight and move in ways that defy physics. In Episode 3, during the tunnel ambush, he uses these boots to run on the ceiling and walls of the Z1-Gon tunnels, which lets him dodge attacks from enemies that are trying to collapse the passage on top of him, and flank monsters that thought they had him cornered. This isn't limited flight, it's complete control over his own mass and movement. Therefore, he can make himself light enough to jump across vast distances, or heavy enough to crash down on enemies with devastating force. He can escape kill boxes by running upside down, he can reposition mid-air to avoid projectiles, and he can access terrain that enemies can't reach, which gives him the high ground in every fight. But all of these abilities, the swordsmanship and the daggers and the divine blade and the environmental adaptations, they're all just tools that make Xylo effective at killing. However, his seventh and final ability is something completely different, because it doesn't help him fight, it makes his enemies not want to fight him in the first place. This is called the Deicide Aura, and it's a dark presence that Xylo emits constantly that causes lower-level demons and monsters to feel pure instinctual terror when they're near him. This isn't a technique he activates, it's a permanent effect that comes from the sin of killing a divine being. And in Episode 4, it's explained that his crime has marked his soul in a way that supernatural creatures can sense. When monsters look at Xylo, they don't just see a human soldier, they see something that killed a goddess, and that realization triggers a primal fear response that makes them hesitate or flee or sometimes just freeze in place. But here's what makes this ability so disturbing. It means that Xylo's greatest crime has become a permanent part of who he is, and he can't ever escape it because the sin is literally radiating off his soul for every supernatural being to feel. The Deicide Aura makes him safer against weak enemies, but it paints a target on his back for the strong ones. And that's the final cruel joke of his power set. Even his advantages come with costs that ensure his suffering never ends. So that's every ability Xylo Forbartz has. Divine-Killer Swordsmanship to cut through divine cores, explosive heat daggers to crack armor and create distance, the Resurrection Mark to keep him alive through death itself, Teoritta Sync to kill bosses with divine power, Blight resistance to survive in toxic environments, Gravity Adjustment Boots to control his movement and defy physics, and the Deicide Aura to terrify enemies with the weight of his sin. Every single one of these abilities makes him more effective at fighting and more capable of surviving impossible odds, but none of them make him free because they're all part of the same system that's designed to keep him useful until there's nothing left of who he used to be. He's not a hero with powers, he's a weapon with abilities, and the only reason he has them is because the government needs him to keep killing until the memory tax burns away his identity completely and they can turn his corpse into a puppet that fights forever.